Ang Mindanao ay isang malaking islang matatagpuan sa gawing silangan ng Pilipinas. Tinagurian itong lupang pangako dahil sa samut saring likas yamang natatago sa lupain ng islang ito. Kapag naririnig natin ang Mindanao, madalas pumapasok sa ating isip ang mga negatibong bagay na nakaugat sa pampulitikal at sosyal na kasaysayan ng isla. Bagamat, madalas takot ang nararamdaman nating mga taga-maynila na nagdudulot ng maling imahe patungkol sa Mindanao, ang pampulitikal na kaguluhan sa Mindanao ay isa lamang salamin o refleksyon sa walang katapusang kagustuhan ng mga Muslim o Moro sa usapin sa pansariling pagpapasya para mahinog ang epektibo at pangmatagalang kapayapaan. And now, before we start, here are the objectives of the presentation. First is to explain the factor which lead to the unending conflict among Muslims Filipino. Ang tagal na ng problema sa Mindanao, no? And even ever since my birth, no, up until now, palagian ko nang naririnig ang mga issues sa Mindanao, no? At noon pa man, ang mga gera na sa Mindanao ang laman ng balita. At ngayon, aalamin natin kung ano-ano ang mga rason sa likod ng walang katapusang hidwaan sa pagitan ng mga Muslim at ng pamahalaan. And number two, of course, to give recommendations on how to finally end armed conflict between Christians and non-Christian Filipinos. No, noon pa man sa mukha ng kasaysayan, may mga hidwaan na sa pagitan ng dalawang Abrahamic religion, ang Islam at Kristyanismo, sa pagitan ng Muslim at ng mga imperyong Kristiyano. No? Remember Crusades, where Christians and Muslims have had established a very infamous event in the face of the world history and the rest of the Philippines. No? The context here, the local context, was manifesting in Mindanao. No? And to proceed, we need to first understand between MNLF and the MILF, no? The two Islamic separatist organizations. No? So as you can see in the presentation, the MNLF means Moro National Liberation Front, while the MILF means Moro Islamic Liberation Front. So they have differences sa isang letter lang, no, which is yung Moro National and yung Moro Islamic, no. So yung sounds familiar, but they have differences sa on their political and communal desires, no. Ang Moro National Liberation Front, or the MNLF, was led by Nur Miswari. On the other hand, Moro Islamic Liberation Front was led by Al-Hajj Murad Ibrahim. No? Both groups are Islamic separatist organization based in the southern Philippines. Its state purpose was to create an independent Islamic organization, no, or region, or autonomous region for the Filipino Muslim minority, right? And this was also known as the Moro people, who lived primarily in the Philippine Mindanao region. No? The MNLF was the leading organization in the Moro separatist movement. So as you can see in the presentation, the Moro National Liberation Front, were actually, the ideology of this is more on egalitarian, means the public law must be funded upon respect to all people regardless of differences in religion. So Moro National Liberation Front is more on political anchored organization, no, while the Moro Islamic Liberation Front is more on religious organization, anchored organizations, because the ideology of the Moro Islamic Liberation Front is Muslim supremacy and Islamic State, no? So parang katulad siya ng ISIS, wherein they plan to create yung tinatawag na Islamic Caliphate, na kung saan gusto nila na ang region na yon, yung particular region, is puro Muslim lang, and yung batas na umiiral doon is according sa doctrine ng Quran, no, dun sa Holy Bible ng mga Muslim. So ayun yung gusto nilang mangyari, yung Moro Islamic Liberation Front. So merong pagkakaiba kasi yung Moro National is more on political, while yung Moro Islamic is more on religious anchored organization. So both of these groups fight for their desire to have political control over Mindanao. And their political desire actually drives sa mga armed conflict na nangyayari today sa Mindanao. These most Muslim armed groups, especially the Moro National Liberation Front, which was way back 1960s, no, started to advocate for so-called Moro homeland. No, so dito magre-revolve yung ating pag-uusapan, no. So the concept of Moro homeland is like anchored to the belief that the Philippines is just a colonizer of Mindanao, no, and the Moro people are different from the rest of the Filipino. They believe that they have this own identity away from the rest of the Philippines, and Mindanao serves as their fertile land. No, they believe that Mindanao is for Muslims, and they should have political control over their land based on their religion, which is Islam. No, and to make it clear, yung Moro people are the native Muslim inhabitants in the Philippines. They are the descendants of the early Malay, no, Arab and Indian migrants into the Philippine archipelago from as early as 14th century. The Moro people formed their own ethnic group in southern Mindanao, which is yung Sulu Island and Palawan. And this is actually the reason why they have come up with the idea of Moro homeland, because they have established a difference between Filipinos and Moro. And the fact that Mindanao preserved their ancestry away from the colonizer, no, which has something to do with the geographical feature of Mindanao, no, because the island has narrow coastal plains, no, extensive yung kanilang mga swamps, and maraming high-rise towering mountains, no. So their culture, their custom, no, all of those are preserved from the colonizer because of the crucial, no, geographic landscape of Mindanao, which sustained the Moro descendants. No, kaya they are driven by this belief na bakit kami luluhod sa inyo, no? If from 14th century up until now, we have owned this land, no? We fight for this land. So parang ganon yung konsepto na ipinaglalaban nila. Kaya nag-come up sila sa pag-advocate ng Moro homeland. And in 1960s, in response to Moro homeland, the Philippine government responded through military means. So gumamit tayo ng militar by imposing yung jurisdiction, power, yung rights, yung sovereignty over Mindanao. And what left after, of course, the thing that what we expect, no, yung war. And according to a study from the Save the Children USA, it is a website source, no, they have concluded that civilians, especially women and children, face increasing brutality in modern conflict. No, they are the most vulnerable. At hindi nga nagsisinungaling ang mga pag-aaral, no, dahil sa pagitan ng gobyerno ng Pilipinas at ng mga Mindanao separatist movement, no, nag-result ng numerous deaths and displacement of the civilian population, both from Muslims and Christians. And of course, being the state, the Philippine government must to take action in a more diplomatic way, no, as stated by late Ferdinand Marcos during his term. Who you fight most passionately often turns out to be your best friend. And with that, in 1970s, the Philippine government initiated peace talks and obtained a peace agreement with the main Muslim armed opposition group, or the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. And for every breakout of armed hostilities, no, thousands of non-combatants are caught in the crossfire and suffer displacements and other human rights violation. And to emphasize their deep sense of independence as a people, many Muslims in Mindanao collectively call themselves Moro, no, or the word used by the colonial Spanish government to refer to the Muslim people. This extend to the use of word Bangsamoro, which means Moro nation, to indicate people separate from the rest of the Philippine population. Later, we will tackle that further, but for now, Let us welcome Miss Nalcy Tanukan to explain the reason bakit nga ba hanggang ngayon ay hindi matigil-tigil ang problema sa Mindanao at ano nga ba ang mga pinag-ugatan o ano yung mga pinagmulan ng lahat ng ito using of course historical point of view.
Okay, so thank you, Mr. Domdom. So I will explain the roots of the conflict in Mindanao. So next slide, please. These are the list of the major historical and contemporary roots of the conflict in Mindanao. This is according to the study made by the PHDR, or the Philippine Human Development Report on 2005. The first one is the forcible or illegal annexation of Moro land to the Philippines under Treaty of Paris in 1898. So the struggle for self-determination by the Moros in the southern Philippines began on 1565 under Spanish colonial rule. So we all know that the main reason why Spaniards colonized us because they want to expand their territories and govern and also spread Christianity all over the country. But the Muslims refused to be governed by the Spanish. So when the Spain ceded us to the U.S. for a $20 million, the Americans signed the Treaty of Paris for colonial rights of the Philippines. So illegally annexing the Mindanao, Americans deliberately deprived inhabitants of their land. Next is military pacification by the American colonial government. So at the start of the U.S. colonial rule, 98% of the residents in Mindanao were Muslims, and then the influx reduced the Muslim population to 40% by 1976. And as of 2005, it goes down to only 20%. So the Moros became the minority in their own homeland. Next is imposition of confiscatory land laws. For the Moro people, land is life. Land rights are closely entwined with the people's culture, history, and identity. When the Americans introduced the Torrens title, which allowing the state to control land and registry, transfer and issuance of ownership title of all land holdings, this clash with the communal land ownership practices of communities in Mindanao. Number 4, Indianization or Filipinization of public administration in Moro land and the destruction of traditional political institutions. So, dahil nga ginigipit ng government, ng ating government ang mga Moros, the government Filipinized the public administration in Moro land, and they also ruined its political institutions. Muslim community perceives that there is a lack of government commitment to provide public goods in tandem to the latter's claim of authority over their territory. 5 is the government finance or induce land settlement and migration to Moro land. So the government introduced a land to landless program. They invited the landless farmers from the north and central regions of the Philippines to settle in Mindanao. So this led for the indigenous communities to push back from their own lands. Next slide, please. Next is land grabbing conflicts. Indigenous communities lose access to the land that they previously used, and the government threatening their livelihoods. And this led to the rising tensions between the native Mindanao and residents and the newer communities. 7, cultural inroads against the Moros. So they saw gross inequality and abuse of power nationwide. Human rights violation and a sense of injustice ignited their desire for meaningful self-determination. The Jabida Massacre in 1968. So Jabida Massacre, it is the killing of Muslim army recruits by their superiors. It refers of killing members of a special military force who were being trained on guerrilla tactics. This is for preparation for their secret plan to invade the Sabah, which they call it Operation Merdeka. 9 is Ilaga, Christian vigilante and military atrocities in 1970 to 1972. During this time, armed militias such as the Black Shirts and Barracudas were formed. The university professor Nur Misawuri formed the MNLF, or the Moro National Liberation Front. Skirmishes often erupted in the settlement areas, and President Marcos he escalated these tensions by deputizing armed forces like Ilaga under the armed forces. Lastly, the government neglect and inaction Moro protests and grievances. Moro people have experienced social, political, and economic discrimination, creating grievances which the government did not consider. Opportunities for rebel groups are limited by lack of team groups or connections outside the region from where they might obtain financial support. And as of now, currently the Moro conflict is one of the two largest, deeply rooted and long-lasting insurgencies, featuring repeated peace processes in the Philippines. So to discuss about the next topic, peace initiatives, here are Mr. Celestino, Mr. Liano, Mr. Garcia, and Mr. Torres.
Peace initiative. Next slide, please. The first peace initiative is in December 1976, and it is called the Tripoli Agreement. An armed conflict from the early 1970s in Mindanao created a major crisis that affected the Philippines. In order to control the crisis, in December 1976, the Philippine government reached out to the MNLF to deal peace talks with the OIC, which is the Organization of Islamic Conference. The agreement is known as the Tripoli Agreement. The agreement says that the Philippines will govern and will create autonomous region in Mindanao and Palawan, and it will cover 13 provinces. In these provinces, there are judicial laws and special forces. And the next peace initiative is the 1977 Sangguniang Pampook. In 1977, President Marcos and the Batasang Pambansa wanted to implement the Tripoli Agreement in Region 9 and 12. It is called the Sangguniang Pampook, but it was rejected by the MNLF. The third peace initiative is the 1987 Philippine Constitution. The Philippine Constitution created a new legal basis for the Muslim government. And the fourth peace initiative is the 1990 ARMM. In the year 1990, ARMM was established in the province of Sulu, Tawi-Tawi, Maguindanao, Lanao del Sur, and the population had a majority vote in their respective region. And to continue the peace initiative, Mr. Liano will be the next one to talk.
Thank you, Mr. Celestino. Now, let's continue the peace initiative topic. Next slide, please. Formal peace talks between government at MNLF. Formal peace talks are occurred between the government and the MNLF through the mediation of Organization of Islamic Conference or OIC and Indonesian government in 1993 because peace was still elusive in Mindanao. Philippine government and MNLF signed the FPA. The Philippine government and the MNLF signed the 1996 Final Peace Agreement or the FPA to complete the implementation of 1976 Tripoli Agreement between the government of the Republic of the Philippines or the GRP and Moro National Liberation Front or the MNLF. Next slide, please. Tripoli Agreement. The Tripoli Agreement defined autonomous administrative divisions for Muslims in the southern Philippines. It is also the establishment of an autonomous government, judicial system for Sharia law, and special security forces. SZOPAD. The 1996 agreement called for the establishment of a special zone of peace and development or SPOZAD and the Southern Philippine Council for Peace and Development or SPCPD. Also, the Consultative Assembly and the merging forces of MNLF with Philippine military. SZOPAD or Special Zone of Peace and Development purpose is to provide basic infrastructure projects for MNLF ex-combatants. SPCPD. SPCPD or Southern Philippine Council for Peace and Development's aim is to serve a special and transitory body to coordinate and promote economic and social growth and the SZOPAD development. The agreement also called for an amendment to the law that created the ARMM or the Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao in 2001. That law makes other provinces vote where majority of the populations are Muslims. The result is one province and one city joined the ARMM, the Basilan province, and the Marawi city. In 1996 elections, MNLF wins and took power since 1996 over 6 provinces and 1 city with predominant Muslim population. And because of that, another Muslim armed opposition group or the MILF demanded an independent Islamic state. GRP. The government of the Republic of the Philippines and the MILF started peace talks. The peace talks are supported by Malaysia, Indonesia, and Libya, and it led to the GRP and MILF Tripoli Agreement on Peace of 2001. Next slide, please. The Tripoli Agreement of Peace of 2001 will bring peace to both the GRP and MILF.
Tripoli Agreement of Peace of 2001 will bring peace to both the GRP and MLLF. The peace talks and negotiation between the Philippines government and the MILF has continued and believe that the Tripoli Agreement of Peace of 2001 will bring peace to both GRP and MILF. The main goal of the Tripoli Agreement or MOAAD is to end all actions such as aircraft bombing, gunfires, attacks, raids, sabotage, and related action that would harm both the GRP and MILF. Next slide, please. As both the GRP and MILF agreed on all terms and was scheduled to officially sign the agreement, it was then questioned by the Philippine Supreme Court, and the GRP declined to sign the agreement because of the opposition of local government members, and once again hostilities started and a lot of people died and seized because of this. By the way, the hostilities is physical armed clashes between the conflicted parties. Even so, for the MNLF and the GRP, the MOAD is the way to achieve peace between to the both parties. May I call Mr. Torres as the next reporter to continue this topic?
Thank you, Mr. Garcia. And for the continuation of this initiative with my report, next slide, please. So the former President Benigno Aquino signed the peace accord. He wanted to try and finally end the conflict, which he did by starting the ceasefire agreement on 2001 that has been in place since 1997, where the peace accord concludes formal negotiations in 2001, where previous presidents have tried but failed to resolve the conflict, which has stunted the growth of the region. Next slide, please. The Comprehensive Agreement on the Bangsamoro. The goal in creating a comprehensive contract is to write an agreement that won't be needed to be revised or renegotiated, that they had signed. And I think that the larger regions that are replaced by the government was a fair trade in deactivating the rebel forces successfully, ending the long conflict, and finally has acquired peace that benefits both parties. And that is the end of our, thank you.
We must always remember, according to Marcus Tullius Cicero, peace is liberty in tranquility. We must remember that peace is the cornerstone of every nation's development. Mahalaga na pahalagahan natin ang kapayapaan dahil ito ang isang elemento ng pambansang pag-unlad.